Hey friends, welcome back to the Animal Nerd Podcast. I am your perpetually tired host, and I am so happy that you're here. This is another one of our bonus minisodes, and today we're going to be talking about Abang the orangutan. Abang was a male Bornean orangutan who was born in the Malaysian states of Sarawak in the late 1960s. He was born in the wild, but his time there was sadly short-lived, as when he was only about a year old, he was illegally captured, presumably for the pet trade. Not long after this, though, he was confiscated by local authorities, but back in the 60s there was no way of being able to re-release an orangutan back into the wild successfully, so despite having been rescued, there was no way he would ever be able to return to the rainforests where he'd been born. Instead, in 1967, Abang, along with a female named Dayang, who I assume was about the same age and had the same kind of backstory, although nothing said that for sure, were transported over 7,000 miles from their native Malaysia to here in England, where they would become the newest residents at Bristol Zoo, their new forever home. Unfortunately, there isn't really much out there about Abang and Dayang's life at the zoo, which is why I had to change this from a full episode to a mini, because I realised there was no way I could stretch it out far enough. And they could have very easily become just another pair of faceless animals, two of the millions who've been forgotten by history. And I mean, that did sort of happen in Dayang's case. I only found a couple of mentions of her in my research, but that wasn't quite the case for Abang. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's still hardly a household name. I mean, have you ever heard of him before this episode? I'm gonna guess no. But if you're a scientist who studies tool use and learning methods in non-human primates, then there is a chance you've heard his name before, and that's because in 1971, when Abang was about 5.5 years old, he became the subject of a study into just that. You see, in the 1970s, primate cognition was the hot new thing in the world of science, especially when it came to our fellow great apes. Probably some of the best known examples of this are the many cases where people tried to teach apes to communicate through sign language. There are several apes who became pretty famous for their supposed non-verbal speaking abilities, and I will absolutely be doing full episodes on them at some point in the future, but this episode is about Abang, and he was never the subject of any language studies. Instead, this study focused on the potential use and creation of stone tools in non-human primates. You see, by this point it was well documented that apes in the wild would use tools to help them get food, but these were always things like sticks. Because of this, no one knew how our own ancestors made the jump from using just sticks to creating tools out of stone, and it was hoped that studying an ape might provide answers in that. The experiments were supposed to feature both Abang and Dayang, but it turned out that having two young orangs together was too distracting for them, and they were far more interested in each other than in cooperating with the scientists trying to study them. So Dayang was removed from the equation, and instead the research was focused solely on Abang, which is also the reason this episode is. There were two parts to this experiment. In the first, Abang was shown how to open a box that contained food. The box could only be opened by sawing through a cord with a sharp piece of flint. This action was demonstrated by the scientists carrying out the experiment, and after enough repetitions, Abang learnt to do it himself. This is what's known as imitative learning, when an animal, or a person, learns to do something by just watching someone else do it. Obviously, to us humans, it's just a normal way to learn. It's something that we do all the time. But it's a method of learning that's a lot less common in the animal kingdom, and it's something that requires a high level of cognitive function that most species simply don't have. It's very well documented in great apes, though, especially orangutans, who obviously learn via imitation from their mothers and other orangutans, but also from humans. It's not uncommon for wild orangs to teach themselves new behaviours just by watching people do things. So perhaps it wasn't that much of a surprise that Abang was able to master opening the box pretty quickly, but that's where the second phase of the experiment came in. Once he'd proved himself an expert at box opening, a new step was added. Abang now didn't just have to saw through the cord, he also had to make the tool needed to do so. He was presented with a flint core and a hammerstone, and again, the scientists demonstrated using these tools to create a flint flake suitable for cutting through the cord, using the same techniques that our caveman ancestors would have done. This, though, was harder for Abang to get his head around, but with enough repetition he did begin to emulate the desired behaviour. The first few pieces of flint that he managed to strike off the core were far too small to be used as a proper tool, although he did still do his best with them, until finally he did manage to separate a flake big enough to be of use, although it still took him a few more attempts until he was able to reach the food inside the box. It was clear from Abang's behaviour throughout the study that he wasn't just mindlessly copying what he watched a human do. He understood that his goal was to get to the food, and he knew the steps he had to take to get there. He learnt the actions required by watching, and when he began to try and emulate them, he learnt from his failures, adapting his methods until he was able to succeed. And what did science as a whole learn from the study of Abang and his stone tool use? Well, not that much, as it happens. I mean, obviously it was yet more proof as to the intelligence of orangutans and apes in general, which is important, but it didn't seem to shed all too much light on how early humans first learned to make and use stone tools. It was much later found that the results of the experiment couldn't be replicated when done on orangutans who hadn't been enculturated. And I realise that absolutely sounds like a made-up word, so let me explain what it means. Basically, enculturation refers to the process of an animal, especially an ape, being raised in a very human environment. It obviously has an impact on them and their development. It can change the way that their brain works and how they react and respond to the world around them, when compared to an animal of the same species that hasn't been raised in that setting. Obviously, it's possible to raise an animal like an ape in captivity without it becoming like a mini-human, but that takes a lot of work and knowledge, and especially in decades past, it was commonplace to raise captive apes very much like you would a human child. I mean, look at any of the ape language experiments. The subject was always reared by humans in as human-like an environment as possible, almost as if they were a human child. And this was something that was done very deliberately, imprinting as heavily as possible on them so that it was easier to try and teach them to think and talk like a person. There's a lot of debate around the results of these ape language studies, whether or not the primates actually understood sign language as a language, and I'm not going to get into that because it's not relevant to the episode and would also take a lot of research. But my point is that regardless of whether or not the apes in question actually could speak, the results would still have been very, very different had the study been carried out on an ape who was living a much more natural life. An enculturated ape can learn to sign, even if they don't truly understand the words they're saying, but an unenculturated ape can't. It's not something they do in the wild, and because their brains haven't been deliberately prepped for it, they just can't pick it up. Am I making sense here? I feel like I'm doing a really bad job at explaining things. But basically, Abang had a lot of human influence in his early years. Obviously, he was taken from the wild when he was only a baby, and then went through the whole thing of being removed from his captors and sent halfway across the world to live in a zoo. And he was still just a baby who'd long since lost his mother and who was instead raised by zookeepers. I don't know how hard the keepers tried to raise Abang and Dang in a natural, orangutan-y way rather than treating them like tiny, hairy people, but given that this was the 60s, I'm guessing they didn't really. It wasn't really something people took into consideration back then. Again, we really don't know much about Abang and Dang's lives, including those early years at Bristol Zoo, aside from one reference to them being taken out for walks, which is cute, but also a sign that, yeah, they were probably being enculturated. All this to say, when some years later some other scientists wanted to replicate the stone tool experiment on other orangs, ones who weren't enculturated, they couldn't pick up the knack of creating stone tools no matter how many times they were shown it. Basically, while the study of Abang did help shed light on the intelligence of orangutans, it didn't really help with its goal of discovering the origin of stone tool use in early hominids. So was this whole thing just a waste of time? Well, I hope not, or else this episode would probably also be a waste of time, and it's a bit late in the process for me to be realising this. But yeah, that's Abang the orangutan for you. Unfortunately, pretty much all we know of him comes from that one scientific study, so I can't tell you much about his life or personality or anything like that. I don't even know what became of him after the study, but regardless, I still wanted to tell his story, even if it's a short one. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus minisode. As ever, all sources used will be linked in the show notes. Insert call to action about subscribing and leaving a review and all that stuff here. It's always very appreciated, and it makes a big difference. Full episodes of the Animal Nerd podcast come out every single Tuesday, so until then, stay wild, friends.